Thank you for taking your valuable time to look at this presentation on the city's draft official plan policies for economic health and employment lands. Why is this review of Toronto's official plan happening now? Well, when the province amended the Planning Act in 2007, every municipality was required to review their official plan at least every 5 years to check how well it was working and to make sure the plan still reflected provincial policy. Because Toronto's official plan was brought into force at the OMB in June 2006, our official plan review began in May 2011. Not every part of the plan has to be reviewed, but the one policy area that has to be included are the policies and designations for the employment lands. Both the provincial policy statement and provincial growth plan allow employment lands to be converted to non-employment uses, such as residential condos, only during the municipal comprehensive official plan review, and they provide criteria for considering these conversions. Toronto's economy has been relatively strong between 2006 and 2011, with employment increasing by 3% or 39,000 jobs over the 5-year period, despite the 2008 recession. And in the past year alone, since 2011, we've added another 14,300 jobs, exceeding both the national and provincial rate of job growth. Toronto's civic motto, "Diversity Our Strength," is a very good description of our city's economy. In a diverse city economy, when one sector of the economy may be in downturn, other sectors may be growing. So the decreases in manufacturing and retail employment since 2006 have more than been offset by the growth of office and institutional jobs. Because of the diversity of our economic base, Toronto has recovered from the 2008 recession more quickly than the rest of Ontario. The economic policies in the current official plan emphasize the protection of employment areas, which are shown in blue on the screen. While both our consultant study and direction from Council still recommend the preservation of our employment areas, the draft policies take a broader approach to actively promote office growth on rapid transit and to accommodate the retail and institutional growth to serve our expanding population. Our places of work in Toronto are concentrated. 65% of all jobs and 90% of export-based jobs are in the downtown and waterfront, which are shown in red, the centers, which are shown in yellow, and our employment areas, which are shown in the 2 shades of blue. Because our employment areas are spread throughout the city, they provide jobs near to many residential neighborhoods and spread out our commuting patterns to ease road congestion. Almost half of our existing jobs and a majority of future jobs in Toronto are office jobs. With an estimated 100 million square feet of new office potentially being developed in the GTA in the next 30 years, it's important to create these office jobs in places where they can be reached without using a car to ease our continuing regional traffic congestion. And since 2009, office growth on transit in Toronto has surpassed new office space in the 905. To help attract new office development, Council has already taken steps to make Toronto more competitive. In the past 6 months, Council has boosted its program to provide tax relief grants for new offices and industry, and improved our Gold Star program to give priority processing to new applications for office, industrial, and institutional uses. The city is also in the midst of a 15-year program to reduce commercial tax rates relative to residential tax rates, to help the city compete for new offices and industry with other 905 municipalities. This seems to be helping, as since 2008, the city has passed the rest of the GTA in the value of commercial and industrial building permits. Residential intensification is going to continue in Toronto, but we need to make sure that where condos are built, the employment space also increases and is not displaced. A draft policy we're discussing would provide that in the downtown and waterfront, the four centres, North York, Scarborough, Etobicoke, and Yonge Eglinton, and within walking distance of rapid transit stations, where residential is built on a site with non-residential employment space already there, that the non-residential space must also be increased, either on the same site or nearby. For example, this image is of the King Spadina neighborhood, where there are over 140 office buildings that are 3 or more stories in height, that have 26,000 people working in them. If a condo was to be built on one of these office sites, the employment space would have to be replaced. But if there was just a parking lot, the development could be purely residential. Toronto's employment areas are very healthy. There's a lot of investment. In fact, building permits for over $960 million in new buildings and additions were issued between 2006 and 2010. The vacancy rate for buildings in Toronto's employment areas is a very healthy 5%, the lowest rate in the GTA. And our employment areas are important incubators where small firms can develop into tomorrow's major businesses. In 2011 alone, 1,200 new firms established themselves in Toronto's employment areas. Industry in Toronto is still important. The GTA is the third largest industrial complex in North America after LA and Chicago, and the city of Toronto has 36% of industrial jobs in the GTA. Employment areas are the only place where many industrial firms are able to locate. Our employment lands are finite, bounded, and there are no green fields to expand into. Once an employment site is lost, it almost never comes back. Toronto has sufficient land in employment areas to accommodate our needs until sometime between 2031 and 2041. So there's a need to protect our employment lands for the long term. Our draft official plan policies call for the protection of employment areas to maintain a diverse economic base, provide a broad range of job opportunities, provide a stable operating environment for businesses, and provide jobs that are accessible by transit throughout the city. Our employment areas provide important and easily reached jobs for residents of nearby neighborhoods. A majority of the workers in almost every employment area live in Toronto, and they tend to live close to their work. These maps show where Torontonians working in the Rexdale, Highway 400, DuPont Lansdowne, and Tapscott employment areas lived in 2006, with one dot representing 10 employees. They show how employment areas provide important nearby jobs for nearby residential neighborhoods, including the shaded higher need priority neighborhoods. The current official plan has just one broad employment area designation. In our 2011 consultations with industrialists, developers, and the public, we heard that one size does not fit all comfortably. Council's direction for our draft policies was to preserve the core of employment areas for industrial uses, but designate other employment areas where retail and service uses could also locate on the edges. Rather than one employment area designation, The draft policies proposed three. 80% of the employment lands would be designated as core employment areas, reserved for hardcore employment uses, while 20% of the employment lands would be in two other designations that would allow a broader range of retail and service uses. Uses that attract the general public would be limited to the two designations generally found at the peripheries. This example of South Etobicoke employment area shows how the majority of the employment area is reserved for core employment area uses, shown as darker purple, while the other service and retail uses are permitted in the other two designations shown in lighter purple along the Queensway and Horner Avenue. Our core employment areas would reserve 80% of our employment lands for manufacturing and warehousing, offices, film and media studios, research and development firms, utilities, trade schools, and arts training facilities. The other 20% of employment lands would be designated as general employment or retail employment areas, where all of the uses permitted in core employment areas would also be welcomed, but other uses would also be permitted. Major retail uses, such as big box stores and power centers, could be considered by way of zoning bylaw amendment on major roads in these two designations, if they meet some important criteria. Because we need to make better use of our limited employment lands, new major retail is to be in multi-story buildings, with a majority of parking spaces either underground or in parking structures. These pictures at St. Clair Avenue and Keele, Weston, show a 1990s big box store with a sea of surface parking around it that the city required on the south side of the street, while a new multi-story retail complex with above-ground parking structures in the interior of the site, our preferred design, is rising on the north side of the street. The number of places of worship in our employment areas has almost doubled in the last decade, from 216 in 2002 to 414 in 2012. This has been raised as an issue by our industrial employers, as the province considers places of worship to be sensitive uses, and some businesses have to alter their operating environment so as not to affect the places of worship. The current official plan permits places of worship on major roads throughout employment areas, but the new draft policies would only permit places of worship in the general and retail employment areas on the periphery. The official plan would still provide for places of worship to be created everywhere in the city, except for public parks, utility corridors, and these core employment areas. Entertainment and recreation facilities and larger restaurants are also on the increase in our employment areas, and would also be limited to these two designations generally found on major roads on the periphery, where they would benefit from greater public visibility and transit service. Retail uses are going to expand in Toronto in the coming decades to serve our growing population. Almost a third of retail jobs in Toronto are found in our employment areas, even more than on the Main Street avenues. Some of the retail is big box stores and power centers, but there are also many plazas and even some pedestrian-oriented retail strips at the edge of our employment areas, incidentally, many of which are not recognized in our current official plan. The only difference between the proposed uses in the general employment areas and the retail employment areas is that the general employment areas would only allow big box stores and power centers while retail employment areas would allow retail of every form and scale. We've already heard feedback that there isn't a great difference in impact whether the retail floor space is broken into many stores or a few larger ones, and some think these two employment area designations perhaps should be merged. We'd appreciate your thoughts on this. Under provincial law, the only time a landowner can convert employment lands for non-employment purposes is during a municipality's official plan review. As of February 1st, 2013, the city has received 115 requests or applications to convert employment lands, almost all to introduce residential development. Teams of planners and economic development officers are reviewing these requests using provincial criteria, and preliminary assessments of the initial 65 were already reported to Committee and Council in 2012. There's no actual need to convert any employment lands for residential purposes in order to house the population growth that the province has forecast for Toronto. Between 2007 and 2011, development applications for 152,000 residential units were received in Toronto. These units could house 270,000 new residents, or the combined population of Windsor, Ontario, and Fredericton, New Brunswick. There are also a lot of additional opportunity sites for new housing development in downtown and the waterfront, the centres, the avenues, and other mixed-use areas where the official plan calls for residential growth, without converting any employment lands. Because residential uses are considered to be sensitive uses, their introduction often affects the operating certificates of businesses in employment areas, requiring them to curtail their operations or add expensive environmental mitigation equipment. The introduction of residential uses to employment areas also often impacts land values. Where the viability of employment areas would be undermined by residential conversions, they are recommended to be retained as employment lands to maintain a stable operating environment for business. An example is the request for residential permissions at the exit of the Ontario Food Terminal on Park Lawn, where there are over 1 million trucks a year coming in 7 days a week starting at 2 a.m., which could easily result in complaints from new residents to the Ministry of the Environment about truck traffic noise and hours of operation. There are, however, some sites where there is a need to convert to residential or non-employment use to mitigate an existing land use conflict. For example, on Murray Road in North York, there's a concrete batching plant and the former Sunrise propane site on the west side of the street, and detached family homes on the east side, with little separation between them. Currently, over 98% of existing employment areas are proposed to be retained. Among the 2% that is proposed to go to other official plan designations, much of it's simply housekeeping, to recognize past conversions and OMB orders, and the conversion of isolated sites that the existing official plan already permits. When our public consultations are complete, we'll report out on what we heard from you to Planning and Growth Management Committee in the spring of 2013, and we'll also continue to report out on our preliminary assessments of the conversion requests. We intend to complete the official plan review of the employment lands and send the revised policies and designations to Committee and Council by the end of this year. We urge you to stay connected, Visit our website and sign up for electronic updates of reports and meetings. And please feel free to email us with your views and concerns at our dedicated email address. And thank you again for taking the time to view this presentation.